Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this, the last of the lectures in this series on the modern history of Protestantism. You'll likely have come across the phrase that I used as the title for this lecture, "What would Jesus do?" It's become a cliche of evangelical Protestant usage in modern America and beyond. I spent a delightful hour or so earlier last week going through the number of images that come up on the internet once you type it in. They range from the maybe most common manifestation of it, the wristband. There's also been a movie with a couple of sequels of the straight-to-DVD variety. There are T-shirts, some of which are not quite as straightforward as they look. I particularly enjoy the fact that T-shirt actually costs $32. There are items which I think are clearly designed and sold with some sense of irony. And there are numerous attempts to take this cliche in other directions, of which this is one of my favorites. Now, this is all good, clean fun. But I want to suggest today that this idea, this question, is of some use for thinking about the history of Protestantism in the modern West. The current era of decline in Protestantism's old European and North American heartlands, even as it's expanding rapidly in other parts of the world, as I talked about in my previous lecture. Because this actual question, what would Jesus do, is a relatively novel one. Many previous generations of Christians would have seen it as a misleading or inappropriate way of shaping their behavior. But it's been asked with sharp urgency by Christians in the modern West for the past century or more, and it's produced radically different answers. I think it helps to shed some light on that story of decline that we've seen in the past century or two. The widely held view has been that this is a story of inevitable modern secularization and skepticism. This is a story which has kept being told since the 18th century, but whose timetable keeps having to be extended. I want to suggest today that it's much more to do with politics, and in particular with the impact of the defining moral event of our age, which I take to be the Second World War. The war which provided the modern age with its working definition of evil. That war marked a resurgence for the sort of self-consciously Christian identity that had been weakening in the Western Allied countries. For some in Britain, and more especially in the United States, that war came to be seen very quickly as a war for Christian civilization, or Judeo-Christian civilization, against barbarism. When the United States entered the war in 1941, cheered on by interventionist Protestants, it portrayed its struggle as a holy war. It honored America's foundational separation between church and state by rolling together the only three religious groups that mattered in mid-20th century America into a newly imagined entity called Judeo-Christian civilization. American soldiers were free to be Protestants, to be Catholics, or to be Jews, but it was assumed that all of them were going to be one of those three. And the American armed forces in the Second World War provided a more intense and better resourced ecumenical chaplaincy than any mass army in human history has ever done. The contrast with the Nazi Germany is very striking. Nazi Germany's military chaplains were marginalized and despised. Those of the United States were exalted. The 16 million Americans who served in the armed forces during the 1940s, that's 80% of American men who were born during the 20s. These men were demobilized as graduates of a unique military ecclesiastical complex. One incident came to symbolize America's crusade. In February 1943, the American troop ship Dorchester was torpedoed off the Canadian coast. 4 chaplains were on board, 2 Protestants, a Catholic, a Jew, and they worked together to hurry the men into lifeboats. Then they distributed life jackets once all the lifeboats were filled. When the life jackets ran out, the four of them took their own off and gave them to four soldiers, and they then joined hands on the deck and sang and prayed together as the ship sank. Reportedly, they were reciting the Shema, the Jewish affirmation of God's oneness, as the waters took them. The four chaplains, as they became called, were symbols and were used as symbols of a Judeo-Christian America united against its godless foes. American soldiers were told so often that Nazism was anti-Christian that when they entered Germany, many expressed surprise that church buildings still stood there. Now, of course, this is not the first or the last time that wartime propaganda has painted itself with the cross. Plenty of Americans were cynical about it. Paul Fussell's famously acerbic memoir of his wartime service recalled how when the word crusade was used, most GIs sneered or giggled. But as it happened, the joke went sour. Allied troops in Germany discovered more than just churches, even if they had believed everything they'd been told about the concentration camps. Nothing could have prepared them for what they actually found at Buchenwald and Dachau. General Eisenhower, while he was promising vainly to discipline the soldiers who, in their horror, had summarily shot dozens of captured SS officers at Dachau, reflected, "We're told that the American soldier doesn't know what he's fighting for. Now at least he'll know what he's fighting against." Fussell also agreed that this is the point at which cynicism died. He wrote, "They'd seen and smelled the death camps. Now they were able to realize that all along they'd been fighting for something positive, the sacredness of life itself. After the camps, a moral attitude was rampant. The boys' explosive little tour in France had been a crusade after all." Every Christian army tells its soldiers that they're fighting the forces of evil. Just this once, it turned out to be true. So 1945 was a moment of hope for what still thought of itself as the Christian West. Only Judeo-Christian civilization had had the moral power to defeat fascism, and therefore only Judeo-Christian civilization would have the moral power to confront communism. The political center-right in most of post-war Europe was dominated by new Christian democratic parties, uniting Catholics and Protestants. In Britain, one of the intellectual architects of the post-war settlement was Archbishop William Temple, who was also, of course, a pioneer of Anglican-Jewish reconciliation. This surge of Christian politics in Europe was not exactly matched by religious revival, but there was a modest uptick even in Europe, and in America, the change was unmistakable. In 1954, the United States added the phrase "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance and adopted "In God We Trust" as a national motto. This is more than just an attempt to use religion as a way of bolstering the fight against communism. It's a recognition of a changing social reality. The previous year, the proportion of the US population who were formal members of a church reached its highest ever level, 59.5%. Polling indicated that the American public respected religious leaders in the 50s far more than any other group in society, and that's a dramatic turnaround from polling results from the pre-war years. Weekly church and synagogue attendance in the US rose from 38% in 1946 to 49% in 1955. Bible sales doubled over the same period. And as importantly, the two long alienated halves of American Protestantism seemed to be coming back together. The clerical and intellectual elite and the evangelicals and fundamentalists, whom the elite had thought had disappeared in the 1920s but had simply been building up their own redoubts, began to engage with each other again. Billy Graham, a man whom it proved impossible for anyone to dislike, even if they tried, was a symbol for this. He managed to bring evangelicals out of their defensive crouch and persuaded both evangelical and the mainline establishment that they could and should work together. You can almost imagine that this could have lasted. But, of course, the Western democracies in the 1950s weren't waking from a ghastly secularist totalitarian nightmare. What they were doing was trying to subside back into the pleasant dream from which they'd been awoken. And we can hardly blame them. After the Second World War, a certain amount of numbness was only natural. But before too long, that war's lessons were going to need to be absorbed in earnest. And that meant doing more than just restating old truths. Since the previous century, some Christians had been wondering if God was calling them not to sing the old gospel in a different key, but to play a different tune altogether. They were observing that churches, hierarchies, liturgies, sacraments, all that were declining, and wondered maybe this is God's will. Maybe Christians should allow them to die, maybe even kill them, rather than struggling to keep them alive on life support. Jesus Christ, after all, was no friend of hierarchies. What would he do? In the 1880s, the campaigning British journalist W.T. Stead experienced a conversion in which God told him to be, as he put it, no longer a Christian, but to be a Christ. So the old question, how should a Christian live, is becoming the subtly different, what would Jesus do? In 1894, Stead's pamphlet, If Christ Came to Chicago, which was a bestseller on both sides of the Atlantic, argued that what Jesus would do if he were to come to that iconic modern city would be to found what Stead called a civic church, an entity which would serve all humanity regardless of race, gender, or religion, and which would be open to anyone who was willing to work selflessly for the common good. The measure of true Christianity, he said, was not churchiness, but the extent to which we succeed in restoring in man the lost image of God. Many of his contemporaries struggled to see how being a Christ like this actually had anything to do with the traditional Christian gospel. As one critic put it, surely it would be better, rather than imagining what would happen if Christ came to Chicago, it would be better to work to bring Chicago to Christ. But the idea didn't go away. In the summer of 1944, strikingly similar ideas were pressing on the conscience of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Brilliant, aristocratic German Lutheran who was one of the first to see Nazism for what it was, and who was hanged in 1945 for his involvement in the failed plot to assassinate Hitler. During 1944, he's in prison in Berlin, the bombs are falling all around him, all trace of Christian civilization is apparently gone. Bonhoeffer begins groping towards an understanding of what Christian faith might mean in a world of that sort. Writing to a friend that summer, he said, "We're proceeding towards a time of no religion at all. Men as they are now simply cannot be religious anymore. If we reach the stage of being radically without religion, what does that mean for Christianity?" Rather than fighting a rearguard action against this, he wondered whether Christians should work with it. Perhaps religion was an infantile stage which a world come of age had outgrown. What if religion could be separated from Christianity? If religion is perhaps no more than its garment, in which case what would be needed would be what he called a religionless Christianity. In a series of letters, Bonhoeffer circled around the problem of what this might actually mean. He certainly didn't mean some sort of milk and water rationalization of the faith, stripped of revelation or divine power. What he wanted to strip away was structures, hierarchies, forms, jargon, anything smacking of worldly wealth and power. The aim was a truly Christ-like Christianity, weak, powerless, serving the world from the cross. But repeatedly in these letters, Bonhoeffer shied away from specifying how this could actually work. If you read the series of letters he wrote over that summer, every time he talks about this, he says something like, "I'll be writing to you about it again soon. I'm thinking over the problem at the present. More about that next time." If he made any progress on this before the Nazis hanged him, his surviving letters don't record it. Now, Bonhoeffer had a very considerable theological reputation in the West even before he became a martyr. That reputation was cemented when his prison writings were published in English in 1952. And these inconclusive reflections on religionless Christianity spoke profoundly to many of his British and American readers. They shared his impatience with religion in the sense of institutional churchiness. This new generation wanted to cut through the formalism and hypocrisy that they thought was occluding the authentic heart of the gospel. Authenticity became their watchword. They felt that the church Protestantism they'd inherited, and indeed the whole of the patched-together post-war society which hosted it, was a sham. And this burgeoning discontent first really took shape not in the margins or the religionless spaces, but instead at the heart of Western Christian privilege in the universities. Student groups were groping towards ways of living an authentic, religionless Christian life. For example, Joseph Wesley Matthews, a former fundamentalist preacher whose faith was turned upside down by the butchery of the Pacific War, discovered Bonhoeffer, and his gospel became a search for what he called a breakthrough to authenticity. He once ripped the pages out of a church Bible during a sermon as a way of demonstrating what breaking free of religion might mean. He became leader of a student community in Austin, Texas, and he made it his business to help that community's members break through their self-deceptions to discover their authentic selves. One member of the community claimed that it was like the early church restored because, as this witness said, the early church didn't give a goddamn about life after death, and neither do we. Now, the claim about the early church is, of course, entirely wrong, but the focus on this world rather than on abstract pieties is true to Bonhoeffer's vision. The deliberate profanity using blasphemy to cut through pious convention, that's a distinctly American contribution. The paradox of this movement was that it sought inner authenticity, but it refused to focus, as many movements of this kind before had done, on inner piety. That was religion. It was about disengaging from the world. Instead, this is a movement which hopes to find its true nature in Christ-like service to the world, given with defiant disregard to cost. It's an awakened conscience looking for a cause to serve. And in the 1950s, especially in the United States, it didn't have to search very hard. I'm going to talk about the struggle for African American civil rights for a few minutes. This is a long story, which up until this point, America's white churches had scarcely engaged with. That changed in 1955 when the leadership of a campaign against segregated seating on buses in Montgomery, Alabama, was thrust unexpectedly onto a 26-year-old Baptist minister named Martin Luther King Jr. King had been raised in what he called fundamentalism, but he'd studied at the heart of the mainline white church's establishment. And his ability to connect those very different worlds and to speak both of their languages would become crucial to his achievement. That and his extraordinary moral and intellectual clarity. The key moment of the campaign in Montgomery, and maybe of King's whole career, was the night of the 30th of January 1956, less than 2 months into the bus boycott, when King's house was bombed. He wasn't at home, but his wife Coretta and their 2-month-old daughter were. They escaped unhurt. But by the time King had hurried home from a meeting, hundreds of supporters had gathered at the house. Coretta recalled that they came to do battle. It could have been a riot, a very bloody riot. The city's mayor and police commissioner tried to disperse the crowd, but only succeeded in stirring up their anger. They allowed King then to speak from the bomb-damaged porch. Not the high oratory that he was capable of when he'd had the chance to prepare, but the impromptu words which the Montgomery Advertiser recorded the following day were clear enough. He said, "Don't get your weapons. He who lives by the sword will perish by the sword. We want to love our enemies. I want you to love our enemies. Be good to them. Love them and let them know that you love them. If I am stopped, our work will not stop, for what we are doing is right." The reporter added, less poetically, that by the time King had finished, the mayor and commissioner standing next to him looked very much like members of the Beat family. The crowd remained there singing hymns for the rest of the night. The eventual victory on the buses that followed later that year was costly and in itself pretty empty. But what King had achieved reached much further than that. He successfully claimed post-war America's moral high ground. This was, as he formulated it, a struggle between the forces of light and the forces of darkness, not a struggle between white and black Americans. Preaching in February 56, he insisted, "We're concerned not merely to win justice in the buses, but rather to behave in a new and different way, to be non-violent so that we may remove injustice itself, both from society and from ourselves. This is a struggle which we cannot lose, no matter what the apparent outcome, if we ourselves succeed in becoming better and more loving people." If you want the contrast, at a segregationist rally in Montgomery earlier the same month, a handbill titled "A Declaration of Segregation" was distributed, stating, amongst other things, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all whites are created equal, with certain rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit." Well, the contrast, at least for those Americans who weren't themselves already in a deep pit of fear and hate, could hardly be plainer. I think it needs to be emphasized how profoundly Christianized this movement was. From King's testimony to his own spiritual struggles, to his organization that he founded after the Montgomery boycott, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, a body whose volunteers were required to pledge to meditate daily on the teachings and life of Jesus, walk and talk in the manner of love, and pray daily to be used by God. The Civil Rights Campaign had an old-fashioned revivalism to it. There were moments of prophetic certainty. There were claps of thunder during sermons, ministers raised from their sickbeds to preach with unaccustomed power, and maybe the greatest miracle of all, marching straight back towards brutal police and watching their power melt away in front of you. Thomas Gilmore, who would go on to become one of Alabama's first black sheriffs, said, "You really get the feeling that somebody bigger than you is walking beside you, and you feel that, well, man, nobody can hurt you if he wanted to." For white campaigners who joined the movement, there's a different revivalist trope: repentance and redemption. Civil rights campaigners, like abolitionists in the previous century, named evil for what it was, challenged their hearers to slough it off, and offered forgiveness if they did. The message's power across America's churches was plain. Even the white Southern churches were largely paralyzed into inactivity, despite the overwhelmingly pro-segregation views of their memberships. The evangelical establishment, more nationally, represented by Billy Graham, plainly backed the cause. In 1961, one South Carolina newspaper dropped Graham's syndicated column in protest against his integrationist views, only to be met with a surge of protest from its readers who valued his gospel more than they disliked his racial politics. It's a sign that the battle was lost. And as King promised, it was lost ultimately not in Southerners' segregated shops and schools, but in their hearts. Most of them still wanted segregation, white Southerners, but they no longer knew how to defend it, nor had the will to fight for it, and so slowly, at times bloodily, but inexorably, it ended. But if most American Christians accepted the power of King's message, one group in particular were entranced by it: the authenticity seekers of the 50s, the ones who hoped with Bonhoeffer to form a religionless Christianity, were drawn to the civil rights movement like moths. This was, for a while, a fully worked out demonstration of what it was that Bonhoeffer had struggled to imagine. This was religionless Christianity in action. It's a movement whose Christian basis is unmistakable, but it's never about churchiness, jargon, institutions, religious cliques. It was led by Christians, but not for Christians. It welcomed allies regardless of their faith. The main student-led civil rights organization, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which deliberately chose not to put the word Christian in its title, plainly looked to King's principles. It was stuffed with Christian activists, but went out of its way to avoid asserting a Christian identity. This was a movement which wasn't going to boast about the gospel. It was going to live it. And of course, it worked. At least, it worked sufficiently. Civil rights campaigning was a matter of courage, exhilaration, sacrifice, labor, a sense of community, which was perhaps especially exciting for those who read about it rather than participating in it. It transcended racial and religious barriers. It seemed much more like true Christianity than yet another self-satisfied Sunday service. The civil rights movement was prophetic, leading the world into a new age. This is what Jesus would do. He would provide prophetic leadership. Unfortunately, not all self-appointed prophets succeed. The early 60s was this moment of heady possibilities. The post-war generation coming of age. The contraceptive pill was approved for general use in the United States in 1960. The obscenity prosecution against D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's lover in Britain was defeated triumphantly in the same year. One of the star witnesses at the Lady Chatterley trial was the Anglican Bishop John Robinson. As a chaplain at Cambridge University in the 1950s, Robinson had suspected and rather boldly written that he thought a Christian resurgence might be dawning. His arrival in 1959 as Bishop of Woolwich was a rude awakening. His shock on meeting the English working class up close for the first time was not unlike Bonhoeffer's shock on meeting his jailers. These, he found, were people of apparently utter indifference to religion, as, of course, much of the English working class had been for a century or more. Robinson was an avid reader of Bonhoeffer. His shocking courtroom defense of an obscene book is part of a wider effort to develop a prophetic Christian voice. He wanted to speak unexpected, riveting truths, rather than always mouthing the same self-serving platitudes that the public had long since learned to ignore. His best-selling 1963 book, Honest to God, was an appeal to the same ethic of authenticity. For once, a bishop was actually going to speak the truth as he saw it, rather than towing the party line. The truth is, there's not really anything terribly radical in that book. He took some fairly standard liberal Protestant ideas. What he succeeded in doing was conveying them in vivid language to a mass readership in a way that had not often been done before. And amongst the calls that he made was for a truly religionless Christianity on Bonhoeffer's lines to be formed. And ominously, this call was taken up not in the secularized cities, not in Woolwich, but in his old university stamping grounds. The story of what happened to student Christianity in the 1960s is a microcosm of that decade's wider religious convulsions. The leading British student Christian organization, as many of you will know, was the Student Christian Movement, the SCM, whose ethic was broad, socially engaged, and ecumenical. It had around 7,000 members across the UK in 1963, a number which fell by just over 90% over the following decade. What makes that catastrophe so remarkable is that it was almost entirely and almost deliberately self-inflicted. In 1962, the SCM appointed a new secretary, its national coordinator, the veteran anti-apartheid activist and Bonhoeffer enthusiast Ambrose Reeves. And Reeves introduced what he called an openness policy. This was committing the SCM to ignoring any distinction between Christian and non-Christian. Christianity, Reeves argued, needed to serve the secular world rather than withdrawing from it or fighting it. He said that the SCM should be primarily concerned with students who are not Christians, and it may well be that we can best serve the churches by ceasing to be a religious society. This reckless, self-sacrificial abandonment of institutional self-interest certainly felt prophetic. It didn't by itself answer the awkward question which Bonhoeffer hadn't resolved. What does a religionless Christianity actually consist of? Reeves's answer was political struggle, working alongside groups of all kinds that were seeking to promote justice and world peace. In 1968, the SCM formally committed itself to worldwide Marxist revolution. A 1969 SCM communique refused to distinguish between the revolution and the kingdom of God. Now, whether or not you agree with that policy, it had certain practical consequences. Most British student Christians did not share these political views, and many of them simply left the organisation. The SCM's leaders, who knew that prophets are not honoured in their own time, felt vindicated by this. For true believers who stayed, though, those who were convinced by this message, it's not clear what they were supposed to do about it. If all the SCM is for is to support secular campaigns, then why does it exist? It's deliberately and conscientiously trying to suppress any assertion of Christian identity, to subsume that identity into radical politics. And so Christians who disliked radical politics withdrew from the SCM, while those who embraced radical politics increasingly saw themselves as radicals and no longer as Christians. Within a decade, Britain's main student Christian organisation had willed itself almost out of existence. Now, that's an extreme version of the story, but it is widely paralleled. The 1972 Assembly of the World Student Christian Federation committed itself to what it called the common class struggle against capitalism. Passed a series of political resolutions. It deplored the failure to invite official representatives from the People's Republic of China, where at that date Christian practice of any kind was illegal. And grown-ups were caught up in the same mood as well. The World Council of Churches Assembly at Uppsala in 1968 chose the slogan, "The world sets the agenda." It's the same deliberate, conscientious refusal to assert a Christian identity. Its focus was anti-imperialism, anti-racism. In the USA, the National Council of Churches moved from being a sort of pretty complacent establishment in the 50s to, by the end of the 60s, a prophetic political voice campaigning on the Vietnam War and a host of other divisive political issues. Now, the point is not who was right and who was wrong about these politics. The point is that these organizations were presuming to lead their members in a radical direction without heed to ordinary believers' views. They were there to serve the world, not to represent their flocks. That's what prophets do. It's what Jesus would have done. No wonder some of these radicals contemplated what Bishop Robinson called, rather sympathetically, creative disaffiliation from the church. Sometimes, Robinson said, non-involvement in organized religion is indeed a Christian vocation. He may have had his American friend James Pike in mind. Pike was the Episcopalian Bishop of California who became increasingly contemptuous of what he called the standard brand churches and their obsession with irrelevant doctrines. He resigned his bishopric in 1966. In 1969, he left the church altogether to form what he called a foundation for religious transition. Its aim was to uncover the true Jesus, who was, of course, a political revolutionary. In the same year, in 1969, Pike traveled to Israel, confident that he would make what he called the big breakthrough to the new post-religious consciousness. Instead, he and his young third wife became lost in the Judean desert. She found her way to safety. His body was found a few days later. It was maybe a kind of prophetic end, even if not the sort he'd intended. Western Protestantism would, in any case, have faced powerful cultural headwinds in the 1960s. But its fateful seduction by a half-developed idea of religionless Christianity made things much worse. A swathe of Christians convinced themselves that it was their Christian duty to stop talking about Christianity and instead to subsume themselves into radical politics. Some completed the journey and became simple revolutionaries. Many others discovered that being a religionless Christian is pretty much like being an ordinary secular citizen, and joined the large majority of the population who professed a Christian identity but showed little outward sign of it. Others remained in the churches but with a sense of voiceless disillusion. No doubt they deserved prophetic denunciation, but they didn't necessarily enjoy it. And as for wider society, well, Protestant leaders were telling everybody that churches were unimportant and they should have nothing to do with religion. Unsurprisingly, it was a message that lots of people were ready to hear. I don't want to seem that I'm pinning all this on Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer knew that he hadn't worked out what form religionless Christianity might take. He did not know that his half-formed musings in private letters would be turned into a manifesto. He also didn't know that the future wasn't going to be as inhuman as it looked from a Berlin prison in 1944. In retrospect, one feature of that environment stands out. The guards and the prisoners whose irreligion so shook Bonhoeffer were, of course, all men. Christianity across most of the world, at least for the past 2.5 centuries, has been predominantly a women's religion. The proportions usually range from somewhere between 50 to 60%. Patriarchal Christians have often worried during the past 2.5 centuries that this has made Christianity seem weak. One of the reasons that Bonhoeffer worried that religion was irrelevant was that so many religious people were women. The modest revival of the 1950s had women as its backbone. But the prophets of religionless Christianity, like almost all of the prophets of 1960s radicalism, were men. And their quest for revolutionary relevance was a very masculine agenda. Religionless Christianity turned out in practice not only to be a denial of the mundane lived reality which makes a sustained religious community possible, but also a repudiation of many of the unglamorous, faithful pew fillers who were more often treated with disdain than recognized as a community's lifeblood. Anyway, by 1970, it was already clear that the establishment Protestant churches of the Western democracies were in freefall, with the Catholics not very far behind. And in those churches, the downward trajectory has been maintained pretty much ever since, with some variations and pockets of good news. Whether the tide will at some point turn for those institutions is another matter. It has done before. There's no such thing as an unstoppable historical force, but at present there's not much sign of it. And for Western European Protestantism, which is dominated by those establishment churches, that is the bulk of the story. Although, of course, even here, in some conservative and even fundamentalist churches have fared less badly than the general run of things. In the United States, however, as you know, things have been different. By the early 70s, it's becoming plain that while theologically and politically radical American Protestants had dug themselves into a hole, their evangelical and fundamentalist brethren were relatively unscathed. The best-selling book of the 1970s in the United States was Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth, whose space-age title belied its very traditional set of apocalyptic predictions. But those predictions themselves, alarming as they were, didn't settle the question of the political flavor that this sort of resurgent evangelicalism should have. And for a moment, a long moment in the 70s, it looked as if American evangelicalism would end up leaning to the left. During the 1976 presidential election, with the Republican Party's moral authority in shreds after the Watergate scandal, a Democratic candidate emerged who was unprecedentedly a bona fide, born-again evangelical, the first such to run for the presidency in the United States. The election poster that was produced for Jimmy Carter wasn't meant to be taken entirely seriously. But I think this says something about the hopes that were invested in him. A flood of political novices volunteered for Carter. Unusually high turnouts in the early primaries helped him to clinch the Democratic nomination. The televangelist Pat Robertson had Carter as a guest on his show and later said that Carter was the one who activated me and a lot of others. And Carter's eventual election victory depended on the fact that, unprecedentedly for a Democrat, he'd won more than half of the evangelical vote. The new religious left was on the march. But as you may be aware, it hasn't worked out that way. In 1980, when he ran for re-election, 5 million evangelical voters switched from Carter to the divorcee Ronald Reagan. Since then, there's been a lot of attention given in the United States to the religious right, but much less to an equally remarkable phenomenon, the absence, or rather the invisibility, of the religious left. Despite the fact that many American Christians have political concerns traditionally associated with the left, repeated attempts to mold an organized, vocal religious left have run into the sand. The result has been a strong impression that, as one junior Republican congressman bluntly put it in January of this year, we, the Republican Party, own the entire biblical tradition. Now, that claim produced a predictable surge of confected outrage. But the real problem with that claim isn't its arrogance, but the fact that it seems so nearly true in American public life and public discourse. For the fortunes of American Protestantism, being associated exclusively with any one political party is a dangerous place to be, even if it wasn't a party that's currently tearing itself to pieces. The story of the religious left's disarray during and after the Carter presidency, then, is a story of some significance. And the experience of the Carter presidency suggests that it foundered on one immediately presenting problem, which was itself a symptom of deeper, more intractable difficulties. That problem was abortion, which was legalized throughout the United States by the decision of the Supreme Court in 1973. As the meaning of that decision sunk in, and as the scale of legalized abortion became clear, happened on a much greater scale than had been predicted, Christians of all political persuasions in the United States discovered in themselves an apparently intuitive moral revulsion at the practice. This despite the lack of direct biblical guidance on the matter, and also despite the lack of there being much precedent on this on the Protestant side. It had traditionally been seen as a Catholic issue. For Christians on the political right, from the late 1970s on, abortion became a rallying point. On the left, though, it was much harder. The campaign for legal abortion was a feminist cause, and feminism was a part both of the Democratic Party's electoral coalition and also of its ideological identity. Left-leaning Christians found themselves torn between pro-feminist and anti-abortion impulses, none more so than Jimmy Carter himself. He didn't conceal his own personal disagreement with the Supreme Court decision. He supported excluding abortion from Medicaid, the federal program for medical support program for the poor. He appointed an anti-abortion Catholic as his health secretary, but he also refused actively to campaign against abortion. The bulk of his staff were, in the jargon that was beginning to be used, pro-choice, and that position was strongly endorsed by his party's 1980 presidential platform. A major core Democratic constituency found his personal anti-abortion views increasingly unacceptable, whereas a large part of the coalition that had elected him, evangelical and Catholic voters, felt that by refusing to campaign on the issue, he had betrayed them. The joke by his opponents in 1980's election campaign was rather bitterer than this one from 4 years earlier. There were attempts to resolve the Christian left's dilemma on this issue, of which maybe the best known was the campaign group Just Life, founded in 1984, which tried to tie the anti-abortion campaign to other so-called pro-life causes, such as opposition to militarism or opposition to the death penalty. It attracted a good deal of publicity, but it didn't actually manage to raise very much money, and it had little success in promoting its candidates. The problem wasn't simply that the anti-abortion message was powerfully opposed by other parts of the Democratic Party. It's more that anti-abortion Democrats were wary of pressing their view, lest they undermine the feminist cause in which they also believed. They advanced their views tentatively, with nuance, with moderation, and that has never been a way to get yourself heard in American politics. But this debate was only a sign of a deeper, more systemic problem. The inability of the white Christian left in the United States to assert its religious identity. They've been muzzled not by secularist opponents, but by their own profound commitment to inclusion and opposition to discrimination. Their aim is to serve a society as a whole rather than their narrow confessional self-interest, a commitment which blends a sort of noble Bonhoefferian instinct for self-sacrificial service with a lingering sense that white Protestant America is normative America. It can't abandon its universal responsibilities by claiming a particular identity for itself. And so America's powerful and politically active black Protestant churches get pigeonholed as black rather than as churches, and white Protestant America has been subsumed first into Judeo-Christian America and then into multi- and non-faith America, making it very hard for white Protestants on the left unapologetically to put their faith at the center of their politics. Take, for example, the 1980s campaign against President Reagan's support for the Nicaraguan Contras. Over 80,000 Americans signed a pledge of resistance, which vowed a mass campaign of nonviolent resistance in the event that the United States intervened directly in Nicaragua, which of course it never did. The pledge was an evangelical initiative, and one which may actually have contributed to the success of that policy. But its evangelical identity was quickly abandoned. If Jews or gay rights activists were to support it, naturally it couldn't be assertively Christian, nor could its campaign meetings include Christian prayer. Or, linked to it, there was the Witness for Peace movement. This is an extraordinarily courageous program which placed over 4,000 unarmed American volunteers in Nicaraguan villages which were at risk of Contra attack, placing them there as human shields. Again, it was an evangelical initiative and began as an evangelical movement. But what about other sympathizers who wanted to join it? So it was broadened first to being what was called a prayerful, biblically based community, open to anyone who was comfortable with that ethos. And it widened inexorably, drawing in liberal Protestants, Catholics, secular idealists. The ethos is progressively diluted. One frustrated evangelical volunteer described how embracing diversity could sap the movement's effectiveness. The last thing you want to be doing, she said, when people you love are getting killed, is worrying about whether your prayer is going to offend somebody. But the fear that prayer might offend had become one of the facts with which the Christian left had to live. I should say I'm not trying to criticize any of these people. I think that the dilemmas that they're dealing with here are genuinely acute. As one senior Democratic Party strategist said in 2015, the right wing has no problem using religious language to push its agenda, but liberal faith leaders, left wing in American terms faith leaders, hesitate to use religious language when speaking with secular coalition partners. And that's true, but it's not because Protestants on the left lack conviction or courage, as they're often accused of. It's precisely that their courageously held convictions make it intensely difficult to assert that identity. So, for example, Martin Luther King Jr. is remembered and celebrated as the leader of a secular coalition and as a hero of civil rights, rather than being, for what he also was, 20th century America's greatest Christian leader and Christian martyr. And this isn't a failure. It's deliberate and it's done for the best of reasons. King is and should be a unifying figure whose moral authority transcends his own religious identity. In the meantime, the establishment churches of the West are adrift. Those who are on both the theological and the political right can still assert themselves, often as a counterculture. They do so, especially in the United States, where theological conservatism is stronger and establishment church hierarchies are weaker. The rest can't find their voice. The problem isn't some inexorable deep historical force of secularization, but the ongoing impact of the political shock of the 1960s, which is, I think, ultimately the result of the moral shock of the Second World War and beyond. I want to leave you with one, I think, remarkable symbol of this, which comes from the 1960s greatest adventure, the space program. The idea of reaching to the heavens in order peacefully to defeat godless communism. It should have been a gift to Christians. And it was in this spirit that on Christmas Eve 1968, the crew of Apollo 8, who were orbiting the moon and looking back at the Earth, read the first 10 verses of the book of Genesis in a live television broadcast. That broadcast, which was the most watched television program of the year in the United States, prompted a lawsuit from an American radical secularist campaigner who alleged that NASA was violating the constitutional separation of church and state by broadcasting this. The case was dismissed, but it had its effects. One of the first two men who actually landed on the moon the following year, Buzz Aldrin, was, and still is, a Presbyterian elder, as well as an astronaut. And he'd brought consecrated bread and wine from his home church with him. And so, before either he or Neil Armstrong went outside, the first food or drink ever consumed on the moon was a Presbyterian Eucharist. Armstrong didn't receive. But the real significance of this event is the discretion that surrounded it. Aldrin wanted to broadcast it. like his predecessors on Apollo 8. But NASA's flight operations manager didn't forbid him, but discouraged him, wanting to avoid any further controversy. And Aldrin, therefore, made a broadcast in which he invited each person listening in, wherever and whomever he may be, to contemplate for a moment and to give thanks in his own individual way. And then he closed down the radio and celebrated his own communion out there on the moon in private. But this isn't a story of secularist bullying. Aldrin wrote about how much, and has often spoken about how much the event had meant to him. The story wasn't concealed, but it came out a few weeks later. But in his memoir, written years later, Aldrin wondered whether he'd been right to do it at all. Perhaps, he said, if I had it to do over again, I wouldn't choose to celebrate communion. Although it was a deeply meaningful experience for me, it was a Christian sacrament, and we'd come to the moon in the name of all mankind, be they Christians, Jews, Muslims, animists, agnostics, or atheists. An earnest and committed Protestant could now feel that he had a duty to speak in the name of all humanity, and therefore, as a matter of conscience, regret privately celebrating the central rite of his faith. And who knows whether that too is what Jesus would have done. It may be that as white Americans and Europeans slowly come to terms with the traumatic fact that our cultural hegemony is over, they'll discover a way to be genuinely pluralist while still having an identity of their own. If Protestants, or indeed the Judeo-Christian religions as a group, can find a way of asserting their religion's meaning and power while fully maintaining that hard-won commitment to a genuinely inclusive society, then I suspect a new chapter in the history of religion in modern societies will begin. It may be that the slow crisis of legitimacy which is unfolding in the Western democracies at present, marked as they are by an increasingly contemptuous withdrawal from a moribund and transactional political culture, that may provide an opening for one of Protestantism's most recurrent forms, namely fastidious withdrawal from political life by prioritizing the spiritual. That's certainly what Pentecostalism is doing in much of the world at present. But if there's one thing that the experience of the Christian left in the 20th century tells us, it's that trying to guess the future in order to steal a march on it is a risky game. Thank you very much.